For more on what the election means for us here in Milledgeville, we're pleased to be joined by journalist Daniel McDonald, who is also operations manager for radio station WRGC. Welcome to GC360, Daniel.
Thank you for the invitation.
So we just talked about the Congressional District 10 race, in which incumbent Jody Hice defeated Democratic newcomer Tabitha Johnson Green. What does the proportions of those votes mean for this county?
Well, this is a heavily Republican district. It's one that's been gerrymandered a little bit to be even further in the Republicans' favor. Of course, we were represented by John Barrow not too many years ago. So when you look at the makeup of this district, it really is a Republican-heavy district. I think they were putting it at R+16 beforehand. That hindered Tabitha Johnson Green's chances. She was a political newcomer, did not have a lot of name recognition in this area, and really kind of was an upset winner in the Democratic primary back in May.
Yeah, I remember that. It was a big surprise. And then also we talked about the SPLOST and how that failed. Was that surprising?
It was somewhat of a surprise, especially up on the county courthouse. It was a little bit of a surprise. Of course, back in May, the regional SPLOST, 11 county SPLOST for Middle Georgia was on the ballot. And here in Baldwin County, it actually won by, I believe, a 55% to 45% margin. With that in mind, county administrators, the county commission in the city of Milledgeville tried to put it back on the ballot with hopes that they could pass it again. But unfortunately, that was not the case. I know that there was a lot of late in the game advertisements coming out against it. And of course, that failed it in the final count on Tuesday.
Wow, that is surprising that it did shift against its favor. So SPLOST raises money for transportation. What was it going to be used for specifically here in our county?
Well, here in our county, they really wanted to put it towards road repaving. When you talk to county commissioners, city administrators, they're looking at many decades of time between when a road can be paved and then repaved. Anyone driving around our county will see that there are areas that have gotten some of that love from state funds and have been repaved, but a lot of times the local governments are on their own. Of course, our transportation system out in many of the rural counties, but especially here in Baldwin County, it was built out at a time when the state was more generous with some of those road repaving funds. That has all but shriveled up here locally as well as across the state. And so they were really hoping that they could get people involved in just kind of taking ownership of this road system that we have here.
Absolutely. I do know that we do struggle a little bit with potholes in certain areas of Milledgeville. I know a lot of students can attest to sort of in apartment complex areas or more neighborhood areas, that is a problem. So were there any other surprises that you saw in terms of the amendments? Were you surprised that Marcy's law passed the way it did?
Well, I wasn't really surprised about any of the amendments. Going out and talking to voters, all of those amendments always come up late in the game. They're always focused on the faces and the individuals, the names, and then it's kind of spent in those last 2 or 3 weeks, maybe even as early voting has already started, that they're going back and looking at the amendments. I know that there was conversation mostly put out by advocacy groups for Amendment 1. Marcy's law, in my talking with voters, there was a lot of confusion about it, wondering whether the language that was on the ballots was actually what would happen should the law be brought into fruition.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of early voting, was there, in your opinion, a significant increase in early voting this year?
Well, there was a lot of early voting, and I think that's a change that's coming out over time. Early voting is not that new here, and I think it's incumbent upon the campaigns to really start addressing that more often. But we had a huge amount of early voting. I think it was roughly about 33% of people actually early voted in person. There was another 1,500 or 1,600 absentee ballot requests put in there. People just love the convenience, but again, I think it's time, if you haven't yet, your campaign needs to tool itself up to really be hitting voters early and before early voting starts, as well as for our news organizations.
Absolutely. And what do you think is the biggest benefit of early voting? Do you think it's the fact that it can be used to help predict how the election's going to go? Is it the convenience? Is it the accessibility?
Well, I mean, for the voter, it's got to be convenience. But, for the taxpayer, it's actually very expensive to have early voting go on for as long as it does.
That is surprising. So in terms of this county, We've spoken about how this is a Republican stronghold or a Republican area, but is Milledgeville itself heavily more Democrat, or is it more of a purple here?
It's growing to be more purple. When I first moved here 10 years ago, the Democratic Party was really strong in this area. And I even remember going out to a Republican Party meeting early when I got here about 10 years ago. And I mean, there was a handful of people there. But as we've seen candidates like Rusty Kidd in the State House, Rick Williams in the State House, and you go out to their events, it really is growing in popularity here. So Democrats can't sit back on their laurels and expect that this will continue to be a Democratic stronghold.
Yeah, it's going to have to, I assume, be a bigger push. And do you think that's going to mean that there's more attention on areas like Middle Georgia for political races in the future?
I don't really see too much of a change. I mean, except for when you talk about the broader trend of Republicans having more inroads here in Baldwin County. It's still a small population county, so I don't expect that we'll see too much more attention in the statewide races. Of course, Stacey Abrams, the Democratic candidate for governor, was very well known here. She had campaigned for a lot of local candidates here throughout the years. She was very well known. Brian Kemp, with his ties to our legislative delegation, also made his face known here as well. So I think it will probably stay the same as one of those smaller but still significant population small communities.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your input.
It was my pleasure, and thank you again.